Virtually everything we know about Jesus of Nazareth is contained in the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, made by followers of Jesus during the course of the first century. This video inquires into what the ancient sources tell us about how the Gospels came to be made. If we pay attention to early traditions purporting to come down from the apostolic period, still preserved in the fathers of the church of the 2nd or 3rd centuries, not only do we reach some conclusions that differ a bit from the standard position taken by most New Testament scholars, but we can maybe even answer some of the outstanding questions that continue to trouble us. To ask how the Gospels were made requires us to tackle the synoptic problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be viewed together. And when we compare them, often they're published in 3 columns or in 4 columns to make comparison easy. We immediately see that they have the same general outline of Jesus' ministry. Most pericopes are found in the same order. A pericope simply refers to an independent unit of gospel material. And within a given pericope, most of the narrative events are also in the same sequence. Sometimes we even have verbatim overlaps, especially in sayings material ascribed to John or to Jesus himself. But there are also many differences. Each author has his own perspective, which comes out by a characteristic use of certain keywords and phrases accenting themes. Each author makes his own selection of pericopes. Sometimes the sequence differs from one gospel to another, and each one follows its own wording. I think it's fair to say that the majority of my colleagues in the New Testament Guild would still subscribe to this two-source hypothesis, although since the turn of the millennium, confidence in this way of construing the configuration of sources has been wearing somewhat thinner and thinner. But for what it's worth, the two-source hypothesis held that from the time of Jesus until the Gospels were written, beginning sometime probably toward the 60s, so over a 30-year period or so, 30 to 40 years, there was oral tradition. Memories of Jesus were passed down by word of mouth in the early church. When documents began to be written down, the usual judgment is that of the 3 we have in the canon, Mark, being shortest, being the most primitive in many ways, is the earliest. And so supposedly Mark was the source that Luke and Matthew independently incorporated into their own work. But there was also another document that we call Q. The letter may go back to the German word Quelle, meaning simply a source, consisting mainly of sayings material of Jesus. Mark is mostly stories, so sayings on the one hand, stories on the other. And these 2 documents formed the foundation on which the longer 2 Gospels, Luke and Matthew, each built. But Luke and Matthew did so independently without consulting with each other. Now, there are other ways of construing these relationships that have been fiercely debated, but as I say, that's probably the majority view. I'm proposing a few refinements to that view. Instead of having a document Q, I'm suggesting that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tapped into a pool of oral traditions, oral testimonies and traditions some of which were gelling into collections, either in people's minds, memories, or in some cases being written down as partial gospels. And instead of having Mark as the source for Luke and Matthew, I'm suggesting that there was an earlier version of Matthew's gospel, I call it Hebrew Matthew, that fed into Greek Matthew and Greek Mark and Greek Luke. Well, let's jump right in. Here is an example of a passage from the Synoptic Gospels. I've used color coding just to make it quicker and easier to see who wrote what. I've assigned the primary colors to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what's unique to Matthew is red. Here it comes out pink, just so it's easier to see the type. Mark is yellow. What's unique to Luke is blue. And then what Matthew and Mark share is red and yellow combined, i.e. orange. Likewise, Mark and Luke. What's common to Mark and Luke becomes green, and what's common to Matthew and Luke is purple. Triple tradition material I've put into gray. I suppose it should be brown, but I've chosen gray. And we see in this passage that there is a central saying of Jesus about the Son of Man being delivered into the hands of men. But the other gospel writers, each of the gospel writers has brought in some material unique to him, and there are also some overlaps, although not all that many of the words of Jesus are identical, just the saying in the center. This is the same passage in Greek. So how do we explain this kind of a situation? Looking at this, who would you say made use of whom? To me, it doesn't seem obvious. And in fact, as we look at the history of scholarship on the Gospels, there have been many proposals, many theories. They fall into four big categories. One attempt to explain the similarities and the differences is by falling back on the fact that there was oral transmission before the Gospels were written. Maybe this in itself would be enough, some think, to explain the data as we have them. Others have brought in multiple fragments, the fact that there were many kind of takings of notes or writing down, recording of collections. One of the most popular explanations, especially after the rise of critical scholarship, beginning in the late 18th century, the late 1700s, and on into the early part of the 19th century, was the idea that there was a proto-gospel, an early edition of the gospel material, perhaps in a Semitic language, either Hebrew or Aramaic. But as the 19th century wore on, a different kind of hypothesis took over the field that we call utilization hypothesis, asking how the gospel writers might have made use of each other's material, may have had direct access. This is what produced the popular two-source hypothesis, but there have been other construals as well that I'm not going to go into detail on in this context. Now, one of the things that got me thinking and wondering was this observation. the oral tradition, multiple fragments, and the proto-gospel hypothesis all find some kind of a basis in antiquity. Luke, in the prologue to his gospel, mentions the eyewitnesses that he consulted as his source. He also was aware that many others had undertaken to compile some kind of a narrative about Jesus before he produced his. Papias, an early bishop in Asia Minor, tells us that Matthew did produce a Hebrew version. We'll talk more about Papias in due course, but the point is those three kinds of explanation all have some kind of anchor in antiquity, whereas the utilization hypotheses really arose only after 1750 and have been dominating New Testament scholarship, therefore, only for about the last 250 plus years. This is a distinctly modern approach to the problem. It's an Enlightenment approach. It came about because in continental Europe and then spilling over into England in the 19th century into the early 20th century, people were looking for documentary sources for all kinds of things in disciplines other than New Testament studies, and so it was natural to approach the New Testament using that same kind of a model. This approach was simply in the intellectual atmosphere of Europe, but whether it's the best way to approach the Synoptic Gospels, I'm not so sure. Everybody agrees that there was a period of largely oral transmission. Jesus himself wrote nothing. He taught crowds in public places. He taught his disciples in private, but always by word of mouth. I'm not going to comment in great detail on the oral tradition because this is not controversial. I would just make the observation, a couple of observations. We've moved away from the view that there was an oral period followed by a strictly literary period. We've come to realize that on the one hand, people were taking notes from the earliest days of the Jesus movement. On the other hand, the oral transmission, the oral tradition continued through the time when our gospel writers were writing and afterwards right into the 2nd century. So the oral transmission formed the environment in which the Gospels were written. There was no clean cutoff point when we moved from oral into literary recording of the memories about Jesus. The other observation is we've moved away from some of the more radical suggestions about creativity or fluidity in the oral tradition for all kinds of reasons. At roughly the same time that Rudolf Bultmann was using folklore as his model and assuming therefore that there was a great deal of variability in the way the early church told and retold things about Jesus. Researchers from Harvard were taking a tape recorder and making recordings in Romania and other places in southern Europe that still had bards, and were comparing those things with the Homeric writings in order to learn how oral transmission actually takes place from a more scientific point of view. By the end of the 20th century, anthropologists working in many cultures had assembled a mass of data. We now know a great deal more than the early critics of the first half of the 20th century did about oral transmission. And while we do see a certain degree of variability in the way that Jesus' words are reported to us in the New Testament, there's nothing like the amount of fluidity that used to be ascribed. And so we think that the tradition has every reason to be trusted, at least in that we know the main point that Jesus would have been making in most of the things reported to us in the Gospels. Now here we have a graph that lays out verse totals. Don't interpret this graph to say that these are whole sections of Matthew, Mark, or Luke. These are verse totals. The verses themselves are scattered, as we've just seen on the page. But here we get some idea of the length of the Gospels, the relative lengths, and the relative amounts of material that they have in common with each other. Notice especially that the gray rectangles represent the triple tradition, what all three verses that all three have in common. Matthew and Luke in particular have large amounts of unique matter. Mark has a good amount as well, but not nearly as much as either Matthew or Luke. And then Matthew and Mark, of course, the orange rectangles indicate what they have in common. Mark and Luke have a certain amount of material in common too. The numbers of verses differ simply because the verses were versified differently, but it's the same actual sayings or stories found in both. The triple tradition is of special interest, consisting of verses found in all three of our synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, making up about a quarter of Matthew and of Luke, and not quite half of Mark. And what's interesting about the triple tradition, among other things, is that when we look at the contents of these verses, they make up, in effect, a complete short gospel. John preaches and baptizes, Jesus gets baptized, he wins victory over temptation, and then we have several chapters worth of material in which Jesus preaches the nearness of God's kingdom. He does miracles, leading up to Peter's confession of him as the Christ at Caesarea Philippi, followed by Jesus' transfiguration. In the latter half of this material, roughly, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. He predicts 3 times that he's going to be handed over to the authorities. He teaches his disciples that they too will have to take up their cross and follow him. And then we have the great events at the end of Jesus' career, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, his fielding of questions, challenges from the Pharisees or the Sadducees. And then he withdraws and has the Last Supper with his disciples, goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane and is arrested, undergoes trials before the Sanhedrin and before Pontius Pilate, gets sentenced, crucified, and then the disciples find the empty tomb. Now going back, the common two-source hypothesis assumes that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of course, shared the triple tradition, but Matthew might have got his Markan material straight from Mark. Likewise, Luke might have got his Markan material straight from Mark. If Mark was the earliest, now why would we think that Mark was the earliest? It's the shortest. Maybe there's a tendency for other writers to add in rather than to subtract. That's not entirely a knockdown argument. When we look at the order of the pericopes, in those few places where Matthew or Luke differs from Mark, the other one always preserves Mark's order. And so Mark appears to be kind of the central trunk or the middle term between Matthew and Luke, and this led the majority of New Testament scholars in the latter 19th century, moving into the early 20th century, to conclude that Mark is more likely the earliest. But there's another way to look at this. Could it be, given the fact that the triple tradition material makes up a more or less complete gospel, whereas the material shared by Matthew and Mark, or that shared by Mark and Luke, the orange and the green, nothing there would make up a complete gospel. Could it be that the triple tradition gives us a window into an ancient document that really was a more or less complete statement of the facts about Jesus' ministry, and the others have added in material of their own along the way? Well, who was Papias? This was a man, father of the early church, who flourished in the early decades of the 2nd century AD. He emerged as the bishop of Hierapolis at roughly the same time that Polycarp was active in Smyrna, Ignatius was bishop of Antioch, Everestus was bishop of Rome. And so we put his lifespan from kind of the middle to late decades of the 1st century into the middle of the 2nd century. Irenaeus calls him a hearer of John. Irenaeus, writing about 175 or 180, and so belonging to the next generation of bishops after both Polycarp and Papias. The anti-Marcionite prologue to John's Gospel even tells us that Papias wrote down the Gospel correctly at John's dictation. Hard to know how seriously to take that claim, but that's what the prologue states. We know that Papias wrote a book in 5 books, a long book in 5 short ones, called the Exposition of the Dominical Oracles, which is no longer extant, although Eusebius, the great church historian of the early 4th century, made excerpts from Papias, chose some of the juicier quotations and included them in his History of the Church. But all of this indicates that Papias had a relationship with John the Apostle that lends special weight to those quotations that we have preserved. There are other traditions of Asia Minor to the effect that John the Apostle, after the Jewish war in Palestine, AD 66 to 70, so sometime in the final third of the 1st century, migrated over to Ephesus in Asia Minor, and there he lived and flourished and supervised churches into the reign of Trajan, which is kind of toward the end of the 1st century. So John might have lived to about approximately AD 100 or so. Ephesus is just about 100 miles west of Hierapolis, where Papias was the bishop in the early decades of the 2nd century. But if Papias was born in the 1st century, he might well have come to know the Apostle John. This is the claim that's made in the traditions we have. There is a trunk road between the two places. And so one or the other of them may very well have traveled in order to meet the other. Here is a quotation from the early part of Papias's book, in which he claims a relationship with people who had known the apostles themselves. So he speaks of the presbyters, and he says in the middle of this paragraph, whenever anyone came who had paid careful attention to the presbyters, I inquired into the words of the presbyters. Then I take what follows here to be in apposition to the presbyters. He's laying out the names of the presbyters that he has in mind. Andrew, Peter, Philip, Thomas, James, John, you notice. This has to be the John who is one of the 12, because he's mentioned alongside others who are among the 12, or any other disciple of the Lord, and what Aristian and the presbyter John, disciples of the Lord, were still saying. Now the contrast here is between the others, most of whom had died by Papias's time, but John outlived the others, and he was still alive into Papias's lifetime. And so Papias, when travelers came by, was always eager to get news, either about what the deceased apostles had taught, or what John and this Aristian were still saying. Notice here the emphasis on oral tradition, the value he ascribes to it. I did not imagine that things out of books would help me as much as the utterances of a living and abiding voice. Now, what are some of the traditions that he received from John? Well, here in the introduction to this passage, he tells us that he's in a section, Eusebius is in a section of Papias where he's dealing with traditions of the presbyter John. This too the presbyter used to say. And then we get a little paragraph about the relationship between Peter and Mark, and how Mark made notes of Peter's preaching. Mark wrote down accurately, yet not in order, as many things as he remembered of the things either said or done by the Lord. He wasn't a hearer of the Lord himself, but later he followed Peter. Peter used to adapt his teachings to the needs of the moment, not as if making an ordered arrangement. Now, I've put not in order and not as if making an ordered arrangement into blue to associate them with John. Only someone who was a fellow eyewitness, like Peter was, would be in a position to judge whether Mark was putting things down in order. And so this confirms that John is the source of this tradition. I've also highlighted things either said or done, and the later reference to the same matter, the stories of the Master, ton kyriakon logion, because there's been some debate about what this source means when it refers to ta logia of the Lord. Well, it's talking about things either said or done. Now I'm going to suggest, thinking about this paragraph carefully, that what Mark wrote down, being out of order, couldn't have been the gospel that we now have. Mark's gospel as we have it is carefully and artfully constructed. There's no problem of order in it. So I suspect that what John was recalling here is that Peter used to preach in a kind of ad hoc manner, and Mark took notes, and the result was something other than the finished gospel, probably a preliminary notebook. We know that people in Greco-Roman antiquity made use of notes, which they called hypomnemata, reminders. The context for this event then would not be the 60s when Mark wrote his gospel, but rather Peter's first preaching in Rome on the basis of other passages in Eusebius. We can date that to the early AD 40s. As for John's recollection about Matthew, Eusebius goes right on to say these things have been related by Papias about Mark, and about Matthew these things have been said. Now it's a little bit unfortunate that this is in the passive voice, doesn't specify who the sayer was, but given the context in Eusebius, I suspect still that John is the source of these things that have been said. Matthew in the Hebrew language joined in order the divine stories, and each one of us explained them as best he could. Here we have talogia again. To interpret that passage a bit, we're told that Matthew arranged the logia of Jesus in the Hebrew language. The gospel we have in the canon is in Greek, so obviously this quotation is talking about something other than the gospel that we have. It's talking about, I think, an earlier and transitory document that perished when Greek Matthew superseded it. Logia here, as it did earlier, refers to Jesus' acts and words. The fact that Matthew wrote it in Hebrew indicates he didn't write it for general publication because the literary language of the Greco-Roman world was Greek. And he would have chosen Greek if he wanted his work to be read more widely. Many authors of the Greco-Roman age made use of a kind of crib sheet, a reminder sheet, and Matthew could well have produced an epitome of the common teaching of the 12 in Jerusalem for his own reference at the time when he was about to set out on mission beyond Palestine in obedience to Jesus' words in the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations. We have evidence in the New Testament that this sort of thing began to happen from about the mid-40s. We're told in Acts 12 that Peter departed from Palestine and went to another place. In Galatians 2, we find Paul and Barnabas shaking hands with Cephas and John in Jerusalem. Or we find Paul shaking hands with Cephas and James and John in Jerusalem about who goes where as they kind of divide up the mission to the world. And then when the passage goes on to say each one explained them, this isn't talking about translation. Because this document was a private document, a skeleton, a kind of backbone, then Matthew himself and any of the other apostles to whom he distributed it would each have had to translate it and supplement it and elaborate on it orally out of his own memory when they found themselves in evangelistic or catechetical situations, and this would have set a precedent and a model for later synoptic gospel writers to follow. All of that would seem to indicate that there was an early edition of Matthew in Hebrew. Do we have any internal evidence in Matthew, Mark, or Luke that they made use of such a source? Well, at this point I would like just to highlight one of many factors, namely the so-called minor agreements between Matthew and Luke. These are places where the two long Gospels, Matthew and Luke, agree against each other in triple tradition material They agree against Mark in that these two have the same bit of information not found in Mark, or the same word choice or phrase different from Mark, or nothing where Mark has something. There are over 1,000 places of this sort in 278 verses. And this would strongly suggest that in this Markan material, those two longer Gospels used a source other than Mark. Since John attested to an original Hebrew Matthew, it seems reasonable to ascribe these minor agreements to their common use of that source. Why cast about for other explanations as though antiquity had nothing to contribute toward the solution? Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Greek on the top half with a corresponding English translation below. This is where the leper comes to Jesus and asks for a cleansing. In Matthew and Luke, we find the words kai idu, and behold. And when the leper addresses Jesus, he calls him Kyrie, Lord. But those matters are not found in Mark. Here are a few more examples. Jesus, talking to his disciples, says, to you it has been given to know the secrets, plural secrets, and knowing, whereas Mark simply puts, to you has been given the secret. Matthew and Luke have the same expression at that point, not found in Mark. When the woman with the flow of blood approached Jesus for a healing, according to Matthew and Luke, she touched the fringe of his garment, not just, as Mark has it, she touched his garment. Or toward the end of Jesus' ministry, one day he was teaching in the temple, say Matthew and Luke, whereas Mark just says he was walking in the temple. Well, when you multiply this kind of thing over 1,000+ instances, you certainly get the impression that Matthew and Luke had access to the same document, and Mark, for his own reasons, has left these bits out. But that would indicate that would be one kind of internal evidence we have in our gospel material, indicating that what John said was true. There was an earlier gospel that Matthew and Luke both made use of. Now I'd like to talk at the end here just a little bit about the independence of our gospel writers, given the sort of patterns we see, how hard it is to decide with any finality who made use of whom. Of course, the fact that there are many different theories about who used whom. The most common one is that Mark was early and Matthew and Luke made use of it, but some have thought it went the other way around, that Matthew and Luke were the earliest and Mark made a compendium out of them, a kind of summary or abbreviation of their works. And there have been other configurations too. It isn't actually a knockdown argument, and no one has been able to persuade anybody else of their configuration. In hundreds of places, each evangelist, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, has lots of unique touches, whether of grammatical idiolect, the use of a tense, or favorite use of Greek particles, has stylistic features, has keywords and themes of a redactional nature. There are narrator interjections. He makes his own selection of pericope, some of which are unique to each of the Gospels. Among redaction critics, the fact that neither Matthew nor Luke reproduced peculiarities of the other is taken as pretty good evidence that neither Matthew nor Luke made direct use of the other. But we don't often hear the same argument applied to Mark, but why not? Mark also has a unique layer of redaction. isn't it even more vanishingly improbable if Matthew and Luke were both using Mark independently of each other, without the knowledge of each other? How likely is it that they could agree exactly with each other in reproducing none of Mark's hundreds of redactional peculiarities? I don't think that's likely at all. Here's a passage that just kind of underscores the point, taken from Jesus' second, taken from the calling of Levi, or Matthew, to follow Jesus. At the center of the passage, we have triple tradition material. There's a man sitting at the tax booth. Jesus says to him, "Follow me," and he rose and followed him. But there are all kinds of interesting uniquenesses as well. Mark and Luke both call the man Levi. Matthew calls him Matthew. Mark alone tells us has this setting beside the sea. And then there are differences of wording or of tense. Matthew and Mark agree in using the word eiden, he saw. Luke uses a different word, theasato, for saw. And then further down, Matthew and Mark agree in having a present tense lege. Luke has the aorist epen. Matthew and Mark have the aorist ekoluthesen. Luke has the imperfect ekoluthe. You tell me, who was using whom, looking at that thing? I don't think it's obvious at all. I find it easiest to believe that they all had before them in Hebrew a common story about this tax collector sitting at his tax booth, Jesus coming by saying, "Follow me," and the man rose and followed him. And each of them has translated it, choosing his own words. Each of them has supplemented it, commented on it in his own way. And so to summarize the suggestions I'd like to place before the reading public, the similarities among Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be explained by these factors. As far as the contents and order of those Gospels are concerned, I think they made common use of Hebrew Matthew. Where their wording overlaps, we can fall back on the fact that oral units were being fixed in Greek language catechetical centers through frequent repetition of Jesus' words and stories about him. A few people were making written notes or fragments containing collections of stories and sayings that the gospel writers might also have consulted. And there are the constraints of usage on translation choices. Although there are lots of choices for a translator, there are certain ways that people tend to speak, and that too could mean that they might by chance have chosen the same form of words just because it sounded right to do so. On the other hand, the differences among the Gospels are easily explained. Each recorder of traditions about Jesus had freedom to incorporate whatever anecdotes or dicta of the Lord he judged to be useful, edifying from the oral pool. And translators do make different choices within the range of possibilities. And of course, each author has his own accents, redactional emphases that he wants to make. And so I think that the oral and the fragmentary and the proto-gospel hypotheses combined, based as they are on early patristic reports, can adequately explain the state of the Synoptic Gospels as we see them without positing direct utilization. What difference does it make? Well, at least this, that if my refinements are worth considering, then it would mean that we should read Matthew, Mark, and Luke as complementary, giving complementary information about Jesus, certainly not as competing with each other ideologically, much less trying to correct each other. They're complementary and they're mutually confirming. If you found this presentation interesting and would like to go into more depth on some of the points I've presented here, and maybe consider some additional angles of argumentation, let me commend for your consideration the book, The Making of the Synoptic Gospels, Exploring the Ancient Sources by Paul A. Rainbow, published last November of 2024 by Cambridge University Press. Thank you for your attention. God bless you in your thinking.